Thanks very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank Lisa and Kath who invited me, and lgbt+Wales and all their colleagues for organising the event. I think the morning's been wonderful, and I hope this afternoon is as wonderful, and I hope I can contribute to that. Last year, excuse me, exactly a year ago, I gave a presentation called A Queer Boy from the Valleys, which was about me and my growing up in the Rhondda, and coming to terms with my sense of difference and my early sexual feelings. I left it as I departed for London to go to university at the age of 18 in 1964. So today I want to explore what happened next, and how eventually, through my involvement with gay liberation, a queer boy, in the sense of queer at that time, became a gay man. It's a sort of fragment of autobiography, and it's a work in progress. So I'm going to read it. During my confused, fearful and anguished mid-teens in the Rhondda, I used to pray every night that I wasn't really homosexual. I certainly turned out to be that, but I soon realised I wasn't really religious at all. I was going through the motion. So when I stopped praying at 18, on the eve of leaving for university, I also stopped doubting my sexuality. I was what I was. I was fearful of many things, of rejection, of having to live an illegal life, of the threat of physical violence and verbal abuse that policed the boundaries between abnormal and queer, normal and queer. But by now I knew that my sexuality was fundamental to me. I could not believe I was sick or mentally deranged, evil or morally corrupt. My sexuality felt perfectly normal and ordinary to me, even if it seemed extraordinary to the world I knew. So the first problem for me as a young man lay not in discovering or coming to terms with my homosexuality. Rather, the challenge was how to forge an identity and way of life which made sense of my feelings, aspirations and desires, and allowed me to survive with and where necessary against others. This became a prolonged process over the first decade of my time in London. An early gay liberationist once called San Francisco a refugee camp for homosexuals. For people of my generation, London was Britain's refuge. My immediate milieu in college in London, I was at University College, was not particularly promising for a sexual life, although less stuffy and more classless than I had feared. University College's broad liberalism went side by side with a hearty heterosexual enthusiasm that I couldn't fully embrace. I secretly and passionately fell in love with a fellow male student in my first year, my unknowing, unacknowledged first love to this day. But he rapidly distanced himself when he began to suspect my attraction. And in my secret anguish, I buried myself further in work. I came out to another student friend, who I suspected might be queer, on a walk through the sex sites of Soho, which he led me on. But he vehemently denied that he was gay or queer. It took another 10 years for him to come out as gay, and since then he's been a stalwart of local gay politics and a lifelong friend. But I'm afraid that didn't help me very much at the time. By the time I'd graduated, I had confessed my homosexuality to a small group of my fellow students, including a woman with whom I had a brief and not particularly satisfying affair. But essentially, my queer sexual life developed in a separated off and discrete world apart from student life. From the start, I'd had an urgent desire to find a queer world, which I knew to be there. Gradually, through casual encounters, I began to explore some of the more accessible places. And of course I discovered that we were everywhere, nicely tucked away. The queer world then, as it is now, was made up of many different worlds, many of them overlapping, and some quite distinct and segregated from others, many with a very long history. By the mid-1960s, homosexuals were beginning to be defined and define themselves as full human beings, part of a vibrant, if hidden, minority, albeit with an unfortunate condition, rather than specimens of various types of sick or corrupt monsters. The television journalist and later MP Brian McGee, famous for his kindly moral earnestness on his TV programs, did 2 programs on male and female homosexuals in 1964 and 1965. He later published a book based on the program, which nevertheless confirmed the difficulty of balancing recognition and othering. He wrote, "Homosexuals are not just people who indulge in certain sexual practices. Their sexual practices are the expression of a whole way of feeling, of responding to other people, and this they cannot help." The electric shock to me still, when I read that, comes in that final phrase, as if we were in the grip of some painful compulsion. Many in the queer world did indeed feel exactly this way, and would anguish after sex about their unfortunate condition. Even in sober suburban East Finchley, where I had my first student digs, I could have casual encounters, walking back from the tube, or in dimly lit conveniences, or walking in the woods by the North Circular Road. Later, when I moved to Notting Hill Gate, I shared a bed sitter with a very straight Welsh medical student, but it happened to be just round the corner from a famous queer haunt, the Champion, which I visited occasionally, at first unknowingly. I got to know the best stations on the Circle Line to meet other men. I knew a few regular pubs. Most of the men I got to know, usually some years older than myself, were drawn from the new type of homosexuals, largely unashamed about their sexuality, but discreet in their public behaviour. Teachers, a university professor, an actor or two, a well-known theatre director, businessmen, a shoe salesman, who I remember vividly because he gave me a pair of sandals, a nurse, a policeman, who scared me to death when he admitted his career, shop assistants, occasional political activists, even Tories. I was learning the complexities of queer life. Through these encounters, I learned the rules of the game, the arts of picking up, and the languages of the sexual world. I never got to know anyone like Quentin Crisp. I would have been terrified if I had. And the only thing I knew of Polari, the legendary secret Argo of queers, was via the camp chit-chat of Sandy and Julian on Rages Round the Horn, which made no sense to me until I took an academic interest in it, a decade or so later. We universally called ourselves queer, and never gay, which was the term used for the more piss-elegant clubs in the West End, which I never went to. Despite the campiness which seemed compulsory to many on the scene, I personally never used female pronouns to describe either myself or fellow queers, not so much because I was afraid to so much, but because I was too self-conscious and diffident to draw attention to myself in that way. I had a strong self-knowledge, however, that though I might be a peculiar type of man, I was certainly not and never wanted to be a woman. London was like a great big laboratory of sexual life. Through my own experiments and those many encounters, some brief and casual, some becoming long-term friendships, I built up a small circle of queer friends, some becoming indeed lifelong friends. Characteristically, casual lovers might become friends. They usually developed an implicit incest taboo, preventing you having sex with a friend or a friend of a friend. Love and sex were sharply separated. In the meantime, I was getting to know about the wider world of queerness. I remember keeping one early pickup awake all night through a feverish mix of erotic play and excitedly asking him who else was queer. Auden Initialwood, of course, Noel Coward, Benjamin Britten, Peter Pears, Dirk Bogarde, Leonard Bernstein, Rudolf Nureyev, Lord Mountbatten. Who else? Another told me about the political world and the queer MPs, one of whom was his lover. I was piecing together a sense of belonging and identity from these bits of information, fragments of knowledge, and I was reading. I would explore the library at East Finchley for authors and novels that could tell me more about homosexuality. Mary Renault, André Gide, Angus Wilson, Gore Vidal, Gillian Freeman, and above all my favourites, Ian Forster, and the Berlin stories of Christopher Isherwood, as well as some of the poems of Auden. And above all the others, the essays and novels of James Baldwin. Baldwin was the most momentous literary encounter I had in those years. I first encountered Baldwin in my final year of school on a trip to Oxford to be interviewed for a college place. I was humiliated at the interview because I was totally aware all the time of my thick Welsh accent, and I was told by the interviewer, who was a baronet, and I'd never met a baronet, or anyone posh at all before, that the handwriting of my entrance exam was ghastly, 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 ghastly. I found solace, indeed life-changing inspiration, in a novel I bought in Blackwell's bookshop, Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. Like many queer novels at the time, this ended in death and apotheosis, but I found hope and inspiration in the descriptions of same-sex love and the evocation of sexual passion, even if the exalted prose did not quite tell me what was actually going on. I wept as I finished the book on the train back from Oxford, sure at last of my sexuality, if not of my university place. Baldwin's experience was quite obviously different from mine. In the black churches and streets of Harlem, in exile in France and the queer bars of Paris, and in the growing civil rights movement in the States. Fulfilling his awful biblical prophecies in the violence that developed, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And that last phrase was the title of one of his most famous essays. Yet I could identify with Baldwin in a way I found difficult with many other contemporary white writers, because his sexuality touched mine. Giovanni's Room was the first novel dealing explicitly with homosexuality and same-sex love that I had read. The epigraph from Walt Whitman exploded in my mind then and remains with me all these years later. I am the man. I suffered. I was there. This, before gay liberation, was to my mind like Martin Luther's, "Here I stand, I can do no other." It was an assertion of self, if not yet of a clear-cut identity, of the possibility of belonging, of community across the chasms of difference, of those endless connections across class, race, nationality, place and time, which bred our mutual involvements and responsibility. As I was discovering, it was very possible to have a full queer life in the London of the 1960s, as long as you accepted its rules. But these rules were increasingly constraining for many of my generation. The country, the city, was in a very strange place, ostensibly swinging, ostensibly on the verge in the 60s of modernisation. Yet the roads there seemed desperately narrow and tortuous if you were queer. Britain remained deeply entwined in coils of traditional attitudes and structures. Years later, I used to give an annual lecture to my sociology students about the roots of the liberation movements in the 1960s. And when I told them a variety of things, they would gasp. The fact that suicide was still illegal, and if you committed suicide and tried to commit suicide and survived, you could be and were imprisoned. Or that single parents, single mothers at least, would end up in children and baby and mother homes and often lose their children. This was to an audience that by then was largely composed of single parents. And of course, above all, homosexuality being illegal. The fact that my students were so surprised by the 90s at any of these examples is a marker of how rapidly things have changed over the decade. But while many of us hoped in the 60s that the iceberg was at last beginning to crack, by the mid-60s, its pace appeared truly glacial. 1967 was the year I graduated. It was the year of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which provided the soundtrack for that first summer of love. It was also the year when male homosexuality was partially decriminalised through the hard-won Sexual Offences Act. But I felt curiously detached from that legislation in 1967. When it passed, I was working after graduating at a summer labourer's job at a building site back in the Rhondda. None of my mates mentioned it, nor of course did I, but I had a strong fear that their warm, teasing friendship for such a hopeless seven-stone weakling as myself would rapidly disappear if I told them I was queer, whether legal or not. The act removed the immediate fear of imprisonment for me, as I was now over 21, lived in England and Wales, and was not in the armed forces or the merchant navy. But I was soon aware what a compromise the act was. The major parliamentary proponent of reform had made clear how limited its advocates saw the act. He famously declared, "I ask those who have, as it were, been in bondage, and for whom the prison doors are now open, to show their thanks by comporting themselves quietly and with dignity." And as we know, the immediate effects were contradictory. The immediate result was an increase, a tripling of prosecutions, not the ending of them. And it took another 37 years for any further relaxation of the law, and that indeed was limited in 1994. The problem was that, as I saw it at the time, still see it in historical perspective, is that despite the bravery of those early advocates, the fatal flaw of the 1967 law reform was that it made no positive mention of the merits, the possibilities of homosexuality. It was a modest contribution. It wasn't so much the beginning of the end as the end of the beginning. Unbeknownst to me, of course, things were bubbling along in London in the summer of 1970 with the establishment of the first campaign committee for homosexual equality, as it was then, groups emerging. But I felt I was still waiting for something to happen, something that would deal with the contradictions which I increasingly felt. Trapped, in words I couldn't find at the time, in the continuing constraints of the closet. I'd first heard brief mentions of something remarkable happening in the States with the explosion of Stonewall and the emergence of Gay Liberation Front in midsummer 1969. A year later, I heard a slightly jocular report of the first Christopher Day anniversary parade by thousands of militant gay liberations in New York on the World at One. But thinking that nothing so exciting could ever happen in Britain anytime soon. But things were bursting into life. I started work at the London School of Economics in October 1970. I picked up a notice about a meeting to set up a London version of the Gay Liberation Front at the LSE. I was wary but at the same time excited and desperate to find out more. When I eventually went to a meeting a few weeks later, my life changed completely. For the first time in my life, I was in a room filled with scores of openly gay men and women of all ages. They're mainly young, hippie and straight, flamboyant and sober, femme and butch, some black, mainly white, all apparently completely upfront and unapologetic about their sexuality, and freely linking the fight for homosexual liberation to other radical political movements, such as women's liberation and black liberation. And I felt immediately that I'd found a space that was a sort of home. Within weeks, I'd reorchestrated my entire way of being, with a new identity, a new openness, new friends, new ideas, new radical political commitments, a new lifestyle, a new home, and a new long-term lover. A fellow early GLFer, Alan Wakeman, in his memoir of those years called Fragments of Joy and Sorrow, describes how he felt my soul came alive when he first heard of GLF. For me, it was as if my whole being had exploded into 1,000 fragments and had been reconfigured into a new form. And I finally came out as gay, publicly and irrevocably. The queer boy from the valleys had become a gay man. Gay liberation, for the first time, made me part of a collective story. A story of oppression, marked by shame and guilt, counterposed to a new story of collective struggle. In the past, we said people had done things for us, as in the 1967 reform. Now we were able to begin to do things for ourselves. This was, to my mind, the most dramatic event in my life, and its influence continues in all sorts of things. The years that followed, of course, would prove infinitely more complicated and turbulent than us young utopians believed or hoped for in 1970. Already by the late 70s, there were signs of a backlash. We were soon embroiled in the crisis and tragedy of AIDS, followed by many years of struggle for equal citizenship and full equality. But I have no doubt that gay liberation was the starting point for everything that's happened since. Stonewall, in the words of the central character in Edmund White's gay coming out novel, The Beautiful Room is Empty, was our fall of the Bastille, the turning point of our lives. My encounter with GLF was certainly the turning point of mine, and nothing could ever be the same again. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got just 5 minutes for questions, if
Any
anybody
questions? Yeah?
You mentioned
GLF?
yeah.
The Gay Liberation Front. And it was the first radical movement in Britain. And it started in London in October 1970. In a sense, everything, all the other movements that come out of that. The campaign, what became the campaign for homosexual equality, had roots before that in the more traditionalist, more conservative homosexual law reform society. But that was explicitly not an organisation of homosexuals. It was completely run by gay men and lesbians. But that wasn't what it was. The significance of GLF was it was a gay organisation. And that, I think, made all the difference. Yeah?
I'm not sure if you know.
It's very difficult to hear, sorry. You just
not sure if you know, but when did you come out in court?
When did I come out to my family?
Yeah. And to the community.
I came out to myself, as I said, when I was 18. I came out to some friends in London over the next few years. with gay liberation, I came out to people's work and my friends in London, right? So it took me another 18 months to come out to my parents. And I came out to them in Easter 1971. I could tell you a long story about that, but to cut it short, I mean, basically, I felt I had to tell my father first, because that was going to be the most difficult. So I took him out to the pub, which I never did, and he said, "Got something to tell me." So I came out to him, and he said, "Well, he sort of suspected, but if you tell your mother, she'd be shocked." He told my mother, and when we got back home, and of course my mother said she'd always known. The difficult thing was what happened next, because basically my father wrote to me when I went back to London, and said he respected what I was, he loved me and would accept what I was, but he didn't want me to talk about it to anyone else in the area, not to bring shame on the family. So I never talked to my brothers about it for years. I didn't know for many years whether they knew or didn't know, because I felt constrained by this injunction from my father. It's only in recent years that I've been able to explore with my brothers that whole experience and what they did or didn't know. And of course they knew, but they didn't know how to mouth it either to my mother, being widowed by then, or to me. So despite the fact that by that time I was actually quite a well-known writer of gay stuff, I was quite well known globally for my writings and lectures and my activism and so on. Within my own family in the Rhondda, it was still something that wasn't talked about. And it took many years for that to break down. And I've become increasingly aware that, you know, the structures are in society, the laws are there, the medical profession can be hostile. All these institutional things are there, are real, but actually in the end it's still within ourselves, and how we come to terms with our sexuality. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could, the JLF had seemed to be unlike any other sort of movement that had come before, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of tactics.
Well, GLF was, as I tried to convey there, I mean there's another lecture, plus one day I'll give it to you, on what GLF was. For me, as I said, its most crucial thing at the beginning was about, in a sense, giving a context for me to be open about my gayness and find solidarity with others. It gave me self-confidence and new range of ideas and so on. In terms of tactics, Gay Liberation Front London never really had any tactics. It was more the excitement of us meeting. Within 18 months, I mean, Lisa's written a history of this, so you can read in more detail. Within the first 18 months, we were going in all sorts of directions, really. We had various demos, we had beginnings of pride marches, we had disruptions of the Festival of Light, which was an evangelical thing at the time. We boycotted bookshops and pubs for selling anti-gay books or not welcoming openly gay people, all that sort of thing. It was sort of local activity. In terms of strategy, what we were going to do with the law, how we were going to campaign for changing attitudes, never really got articulated in those first 2 years. And after 1972, it fragmented into many different directions. It changed the nature of the campaign for homosexual equality, which became a more effective, for a time at least, campaigning organisation. All sorts of other activities grew out of it, which I think many of them still endure. But by the end of the 70s, there was, despite, we started as a few tens, dozens, then hundreds and a couple of thousand. By the end of the 70s, there was increasingly mass coming out. but that wasn't politically effective. And there were the elements of a backlash developing. And the 1980s, despite a huge expansion of the LGBT scene, and particularly of lesbian life actually, and activism in the political parties, even the Conservative Party, by the time of the advent of the Thatcher government in 1979, there was a strong feeling that the initiative had been lost to more right-wing forces. And then the AIDS crisis erupted in the midst of that. And by the end of the 80s, as Lisa said in the talk this morning, there was a need for something more focused, more directed, and Stonewall, the organisation, developed out of that. And it was only in the 20 years after that the real change came about. So the change that GLF brought about wasn't in legal equality or even social equality, it was in actually inspiring a mass coming out, which I think is a greatly underestimated contribution. Because today, everyone knows someone who is LGBT. They may not like it, but they can't pretend it's hidden away. So the breakthrough in 1970 was in actually opening the doors for us to come out by that sense of collective solidarity. And that was the crucial breakthrough to mine.
Have we got any more questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.